19 Mike Tango, understand you're losing oil pressure?
Yes, we are losing oil pressure. This is an emergency. 19 Mike Tango.
19 Mike Tango, roger. I'm vectoring you. You're right overhead the Westchester County Airport now, so I'm going to put you on a left downwind for runway 16.
Okay, vectoring me for left downwind for runway 16, 19 Mike Tango.
That's ATC audio from an emergency that ended in a fatal crash earlier this month, and it's our main topic of discussion today. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking about a Bonanza crash that occurred 10 days ago near the Westchester County Airport in upstate New York. It started with a small engine problem that got worse, and we'll talk about what the pilot and controller might have done differently. And so that you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app that you're listening to us now, take a moment and touch the subscribe or the follow key now so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 260, we talked with Rob Mark about a listener question about when to consider doing the impossible turn. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/260. And this is a listener-supported show, and we rely upon the support of people like you. So if you get benefit from this episode or you've gotten value from our show, please take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to sign up to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. This week in the news, the preliminary report is out on an airline worker who got sucked into a jet engine. A CFI who buzzed boaters in Colorado is now in trouble with the law. And Netflix has a job opening that you might want to apply for. All this and more, and the news starts now. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, the NTSB prelim report is out on the American Eagle ground worker who got sucked into an engine. The accident occurred when a ground worker was sucked into the engine of an American Eagle jet at the Montgomery Regional Airport in Alabama on New Year's Eve. The report provides the first account of how the female ground worker was killed after she apparently strayed too close to the moving jet engine of an Embraer ERJ-175 regional jet. The aircraft had just landed in Alabama following an uneventful flight from Dallas when the pilots decided to keep the engines running. Normally, engines could be shut down earlier, but in this case, the auxiliary power unit, or APU, was broken, so the engines had to stay running until the aircraft was connected to ground power. The pilots told NTSB investigators that they had decided to keep the engines running for a full 2 minutes after reaching the stand for a required cool-down period. It was during this time that the ground worker was fatally injured when she was ingested into the left-hand engine. This is a particularly dangerous time for ground workers due to the risk of engine ingestion, and there is a slew of safety rules designed to prevent workers from getting too close to an engine until it is fully shut down. Along with witness testimony from the pilots and other workers who were present at the time, investigators have been assisted by video surveillance footage that captured the incident. The footage showed the deceased ground worker walking toward the back of the airplane where another ramp agent told investigators that he saw her nearly fall over from the power of the engine exhaust. He attempted to warn her to stay back, but the surveillance footage shows the female worker started walking toward the left wingtip before disappearing from view. She reappeared on camera as she walked in front of the left-hand engine where she was pulled off her feet into the engine. The whole incident happened so quickly that the captain was initially unsure what had happened. His first indication that something was wrong was when the aircraft shook violently and the left-hand engine went into automatic shutdown mode. The captain then left the flight deck to find that the ground worker had been tragically killed. Other team members working the flight told the NTSB that they held a joint safety briefing just 10 minutes before the airplane arrived. They then conducted a second safety huddle just before the airplane arrived, where they discussed the fact that the engines would continue running and that no one should approach the aircraft. Included in this briefing was a warning that ground workers shouldn't approach the aircraft with safety cones until after the engines had been shut down. The surveillance video appears to show the deceased worker go to the back of the plane with a safety cone. Leading up to the fatal accident, the upper and lower aircraft beacon lights were flashing, an indication that the engines were running. None of the 59 passengers and 4 crew members were injured in the accident. After remaining on the ground for several days, the aircraft returned to service on January 8th and continues to fly on behalf of American Eagle. From viewfromthewing.com, American Airlines pilot union trying to cover for crew in New York near disaster. On January 13th, an American Airlines Boeing 777 headed to London taxied on the wrong runway as a Delta 737 began its takeoff roll. This was nearly a disaster as the American jet crossed right in front of Delta and the Delta plane hit the brakes. The Delta flight stopped less than 1,000 feet from where it would have intersected with American's plane. The transatlantic 777 didn't follow ATC instructions. It was told whom to call to report the incident, and half an hour later took off for Heathrow. It nearly caused a disaster, and now the Airline Pilots Association is running interference in the media. This article claims that an article written for Forbes magazine is carrying a union narrative. It says the American Airline Pilots Union has been saying that they've been warning about safety because of new procedures they say they haven't yet been trained on. Yet 1 Mile at a Time reports that these narratives, though correct, don't address why the experienced captain taxied the plane to the wrong runway, and that makes the rest of the piece basically irrelevant, they say. This article says that there is zero indications that the new procedures referenced in the Forbes article had anything to do with this incident. The article continues, notice that when the union promotes these as a problem, they never specify the particulars. For instance, the first officer announcing flight attendants prepare for takeoff is not what caused this. And here's a short quote from the Forbes article that's referenced. It says, the first officer on American Airlines Flight 106, which was involved in a runway incursion Friday night at JFK, was flying her first flight with new cockpit procedures. At the time of the incursion, which forced a Delta Airlines aircraft to stop suddenly, the first officer was engaged in a series of tasks that involved processing takeoff data that included flap and power settings, as well as a runway assessment. But for the first time under new procedures introduced January 2nd, she also had to make an announcement informing passengers and flight attendants of the impending takeoff, said the source, a pilot who has knowledge of the incident and who asked not to be named. The procedures require the 777 first officer to inform passengers and flight attendants that takeoff is imminent. That announcement was previously made by the captain. It requires the first officer to interrupt continuing tasks, be precise on timing, and change intercom settings. The first officer, an experienced 737 pilot, was making her first 777 flight after 100 hours of training flights that did not include the new procedures. The Allied Pilots Association, which represents 15,000 American pilots, said that the new cockpit procedures involve an attempt to alter critical procedures through a 35-page bulletin and changes in a 65-page manual rather than through in-person training. From flyingmag.com, G100UL avgas replacement set to soon hit the pumps. Now, this is a long article, but it says in part, the plan is to start in California, a fairly big stage and the number one state in volume. The decision by some California airports to ban 100 low-lead is also a prominent factor in rolling out in California first, as this may occur at other airports in the Golden State, and something must be ready to fill the void. When asked about the speed of delivery, a spokesman said to expect a slow start at first, then allow the domino effect to start pumping in other regions. He assured us that the evolution would not be like Black Friday at Best Buy. He said 100 low-lead is challenging to produce and distribute. It's a boutique fuel in terms of volume, hence why there is a limited number of producers. Although they are not pumping G1000UL yet, they are ramping up and preparing for launch. Early estimates show a March or April initial rollout focused on a limited number of airports in California. GAMI intends to utilize the existing distribution network. Avfuel and GAMI will issue a license to produce G100UL. Production and distribution will be in multiple locations based on demand, and G100UL does not need a refinery. STCs for the G100UL are now available at G100UL.com, and GAMI encourages early adopters to help them fund the initial production streams. Signing on early will provide much-needed capital and assist with production cost and logistical issues. From avweb.com, FAA clarifies previous change notice on charting private airports. EAA, the Experimental Aircraft Association, reported that the FAA has apparently walked back from a decision last September to remove references to some private airports on sectional charts. In its charting notice, the agency wrote that, effective November 3, 2022, VFR aeronautical charts will no longer make a reference to emergency value in private airport charting. Only private airports with landmark value will be retained and charted beyond February 23, 2023. Citing pilots using VFR charts for flight planning and in emergency situations, EAA expressed concern, noting that, quote, the approximately 14,400 private airfields in the U.S. account for nearly 75% of the nation's total airports and are indispensable parts of our GA infrastructure. In a special notice 2 weeks ago, clarifying the original charting notice, the FAA wrote, beyond the December 29, 2022 effective date, private airports will continue to be charted for their landmark value. Landmark value will continue to be determined using the same multiple criteria prior to the removal of emergency or text from the legend. VFR aeronautical chart users should not see a significant change to private airports depicted on VFR charts. Also from avweb.com, new rule allows voluntary 70-year-old age limit for charter and fractional pilots. In what has been described as a reasonable compromise, the federal omnibus spending bill passed last month established a pathway for large fractional owners and charter providers to set a 70-year-old age limit for their pilots. That compares with the 65-year-old limit for airline pilots. The new limits would not be mandatory but optional, though once set, the age limit would remain permanent under law. The new legal setup is a modification of a 2018 proposal that was part of that year's FAA financial reauthorization package. Under that arrangement, said to apply to NetJets without naming the company specifically, it would apply only to operations with annual flight times exceeding 150,000 hours. The new voluntary proposal caps the flight time for operators under Part 135 or Part 91K, a set of rules carved out for fractional operations, at half that, so that more operators who choose to apply the age limit could do so. From GeneralAviationNews.com, Man versus Machine. And this comes from an ASRS report written by a CFI. He writes, my student and I were on final approach to runway 23 at Doylestown Airport, KDYL in Pennsylvania. We noted a maintenance worker on the left side of the runway further downfield near taxiway Charlie. The worker was well outside the runway safety area, so my student and I continued the approach. Upon landing and on the rollout, the worker entered the runway and walked slowly across, forcing us to use maximum braking action to prevent colliding with him, as a go-around was no longer a safe option due to minimal speed and obstacles to clear on departure. A weather briefing was gathered. NOTAMs were also checked via our EFB app, and there was no mention of workers possibly being on the runway or near the runway safety environment. And here's a follow-up to a story that we talked about a few months ago from avweb.com. The first of two stories related to this. Low passes over boats preceded crash. The NTSB said a pilot and instructor flew low passes over two boats on a lake near Fort Collins, Colorado, before their Cessna crashed last September. In its final report on the mishap, which wrecked the 172 and resulted in minor injuries to the occupants, the NTSB cited the probable cause as, quote, the pilot's failure to maintain clearance from rising terrain while intentionally maneuvering the airplane at low altitudes. The report said the instructor also gave conflicting accounts of the events to investigators. And this just out from the ColoradoSun.com, charges filed against the pilot who flew plane recklessly low over boat on Horsetooth Reservoir. Investigators are looking for Ahmed El-Qadah, who is accused of flying the single-engine plane over Horsetooth Reservoir before it crashed in nearby mountains, the sheriff's office said. They found the pilot and passenger with minor injuries, but believe El-Qadah left the country shortly after the crash and has not returned. The FBI determined that the pilot's action didn't meet the criteria for federal charges. However, El-Qadah faces 5 counts of menacing and 6 counts of reckless endangerment, all misdemeanors, according to the sheriff's office. And his LinkedIn page lists him as a full-time flight instructor for the past year at Journeys Aviation, Inc. in Boulder, Colorado. Prior to that, it says he served for nearly 3 years as a first officer on Commute Air, DBA, United Express. And also from Colorado, this comes from CBSNews.com. Colorado Airlife helicopter pilot headed to work arrested, charged with DUI. A Colorado Airlife helicopter pilot, described by sheriff's deputies as unsteady and wobbling, was arrested earlier this month and charged with DUI as he was headed to apparently fly a medical helicopter from his work base in Lincoln County. Airlife Denver is the emergency medical care and critical care transport service of Health One's system of hospitals. Court and pilot records show that the pilot was stopped on the night of January 7th as he was headed to work. Breath tests later showed his blood alcohol level was .126, above Colorado's legal standard of .08 for driving under the influence. The pilot was flying for Air Life at the time of the stop, according to arrest documents, was in full flight uniform when he was arrested, and told deputies he was on his way to his base in Hugo, Colorado. The pilot's lawyer said, quote, "He is fully cooperating with the investigation and is taking the matter seriously. He has since resigned his position." Sheriff's office documents say a deputy was on routine patrol at 7:30 p.m. when he spotted a car behind him on Highway 86. The deputy let the car pass and said the vehicle then crossed over the center yellow line while weaving, crossed the yellow double center line to pass two other vehicles, and drove 70 miles an hour in a 55-mile zone. The deputy said that when the pilot was stopped and rolled down his window, there was the smell of a strong unknown alcoholic beverage, and that he was in his flight for life suit. After the deputy said he failed a roadside sobriety test, the pilot was arrested and jailed for suspected DUI, speeding, and careless driving. A 2009 news article profiling the pilot reported he had 36 months of combat experience during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and his LinkedIn profile describes him as a senior Army aviator with more than 20 years of military experience. And here's a follow-up story to an accident of a Pilatus PC-12 that Rob Mark and I talked about a year ago in episode 221. You may recall that was a short flight in North Carolina, just 61 miles, to bring a group back from a duck hunting trip. It killed 8 people, including 4 teens. According to NHRegister.com, lawsuits in North Carolina plane crash that killed 8 have been settled for $15 million. The families of 5 passengers killed in the 2022 crash off the North Carolina coast have settled wrongful death lawsuits against the companies that owned the plane and employed the pilot and the pilot's estate for $15 million. All 8 people aboard the Pilatus PC-12/47 died when it descended into the Atlantic off the Outer Banks. 4 teenagers and 2 adults on the plane were returning from a hunting trip. The 2 others were the pilot and his adult son, who was a student pilot. The suit filed in May alleged that the pilot failed to maintain control over the plane and improperly flew into weather conditions with limited visibility that required the use of instrumentation. The suit also asserted that the pilot failed to maintain adequate communications with ATC and failed to avoid restricted military airspace, leading to an erratic and irregular flight path. The suit alleged the pilot improperly relied on a co-pilot with inadequate training and experience to fly around the restricted airspace and in those weather conditions. The pilot's son, who was acting as co-pilot, reportedly had 20 hours of flight experience. The suit also claimed that the pilot failed to conduct a proper weight and balance evaluation before taking off. From Aerotime.aero, FAA releases guidelines for GA pilots as Super Bowl 57 nears. The FAA is gearing up for Super Bowl 2023 by releasing guidelines for GA pilots. This year's Super Bowl is taking place at the State Farm Stadium in Glendale, Arizona on Sunday, February 12th. Pilots should anticipate a TFR in the Phoenix area on Sunday the 12th. Typical TFRs limit the availability of certain operations, including glider operations, flight training, and UAV operations. The FAA said it will release a note about the procedures for the game and specific arrival and departure requirements by the end of January. To minimize delays and ensure safety, the Department of Transportation advised that special air traffic procedures will be in effect for a number of airports from February 8th through the 13th. The FAA will publish a TFR for Super Bowl 57. The FAA expects the TFR will be active from 3:30 to 9 p.m. local on February the 12th. The FAA said the TFR will have a 10 nautical mile inner core and a 30 nautical mile outer ring. Lastly, the FAA stated that this is strictly a no-drone zone as a designated national security special event. Additional unplanned aircraft restrictions will be in place before, during, and after the games. And finally, from Aerotime.aero, Netflix in search of a flight attendant willing to pay up to $385,000 per year. It's not every day that you see a high-flying, high-paying job opening that's fit for the movies. American video streaming service company Netflix is advertising for the role of a flight attendant on the company's private jet based out of San Jose, California. Quote, "This is a lead position for a Northern California-based flight attendant, and the right candidate will be professionally trained in cabin and passenger safety and aircraft emergency evacuation," the company stated in its job description. Netflix also said the perfect candidate must demonstrate independent judgment, discretion, and outstanding customer service skills necessary to provide a seamless experience for our passengers. The salary range that Netflix is offering for the position is $60,000 to $385,000. The description says that Netflix is looking for a lead and primary flight attendant for its Gulfstream G550 business jet. Apart from the flight attendant role, Netflix is also currently hiring an aircraft maintenance technician based in Burbank, California, and a pilot based in Los Gatos, California. And if this happens to be the last episode of Aviation News Talk, you'll know that I took that flight attendant job and a nice pay increase. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then we'll talk about the crash in Westchester County, New York. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's go to the good news department. First, congratulations to my client, Ewan Ashley. He just passed his instrument rating in a Cessna 206 a couple of days ago. Now, that plane will soon be for rent at the West Valley Flying Club. It's also equipped with TKS anti-icing system. So if you're interested in renting that airplane, contact me for a checkout. Again, congratulations, Ewan. And Alexander Sack writes that he passed his commercial back in December. Congratulations. Not only that, he says he recently had an article published in AOPA, so that's great. And congratulations to Matt Abbey from Ohio. He writes, I recently passed my CFI airplane check ride in December. Thanks for your very informative content, especially the mock check ride episodes with DPE Jason Blair. I will be directing future students to your podcast for continuing education. Thanks for that, Matt. And again, congratulations. And if you've recently passed a check ride, hey, let me know. Just go on out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page, and I'll share your good news right here. And next up is a recording from Patreon mega supporter Tim Delaney.
Hey, Max, Tim Delaney in Boise, Idaho. I was listening to podcast number 260 with Rob Mark regarding the impossible turn after takeoff. Something that I have tried many times and is quite interesting to do is to go to an airport with a long runway like the Mesa Airport in Sacramento, California, or the Boise Airport in Boise, Idaho. Tell the tower what you're going to do, which is take off at 300 feet, cut the power, and put the plane back on the runway. It's amazing how quickly your airspeed drops off, even when you're anticipating it, and how much you have to push the nose down to get back on the runway. Nothing to do with the impossible turn, but at least gives you an idea of what happens that if you're going to put the plane down straight ahead, what it's like to actually do that. I strongly recommend pilots try this. Maybe take a flight instructor with them just to be sure. Anyway, hope that helps. Great podcast, Max. Always learning something from you. Keep up the good work. Thanks. Bye.
Tim, thanks so much for sending us that recording. And yes, I think that's good practice. The first time you do it, you may want to be up at a higher altitude, a couple thousand feet up, just to see when you pull the power how far you need to lower the nose so that you're not doing that for the first time down close to the runway. And if you'd like to send an audio recording, just as Tim did, it's very easy. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question at the top, where you can use our SpeakPipe app, which will send a 90-second recording directly to me. And interestingly, Scott Urschel sent this email, which touches on the same topic. He says, I'd like to share two videos. One is my son flying an Aranca Champ and experiencing LOTOT, loss of thrust on takeoff. Note the pitch change required to maintain airspeed about 24 degrees. So that's a very big pitch change. He notes you can't stall an airplane at 0 or low G. He also sent along two videos, one of his son pushing the nose down after pulling the throttle off, and the other of his son soloing on his 16th birthday in both an Aranca Champ and a Robinson R-44 helicopter. He then went off to do his driving test. Those are great videos, so I'll include links to both of them in the show notes. He also said, I really enjoy your podcast, but especially knowing when to attempt the impossible turn with Rob Mark in episode 260. Fantastic job. I'm a CFII rotorcraft and fixed-wing pilot with several type ratings and Warbird experimental authorizations. I was upset when AOPA published the video last year on the impossible turn and wrote to the president and one of the pilots in the videos. And in that particular video, yeah, I totally understand your point on that. They had pilots in several different airplanes practicing the impossible turn, but they did it by taking off from the airport first. We've always recommended you practice this first at altitude. Try maybe 2,000 feet above the ground first. Just trying it out from the ground is really asking for trouble. He writes, Rob is spot on. I was so happy to listen to your podcast today. Keep up the good work. Thanks so much for that, Scott. And here's a message from patron supporter Sam Dawson. He wrote, I'm sure you have also flown older aircraft that only have lap belts. And actually, not in a really long time. I avoid those airplanes. He says, I've always been uncomfortable doing so. I once shared a Mooney M20B with someone and told the owner his first purchase should be the shoulder harnesses. I even gave him money to help with the cost. Several years ago, I had an acquaintance killed in an off-airport landing that should have been survivable, especially as his airplane was equipped with shoulder harnesses. But I knew it was his habit to take off his shoulder harness after takeoff, and I think during the off-airport sequence, he forgot to put it back on. Sam also writes a very good discussion on the impossible turn, a few thoughts to emphasize things you discussed. I teach pilots to treat airports with encroachments as short-field airports, even if the runway length is not short. This emphasizes getting altitude, but needs to be balanced with the need to cool the engine and safety. Climbing at VX does not leave much margin if the engine fails, but I'm with Rob Mark on this. Climb at VY until you have glide distance to a landing area. Also, a return to the airport, in the case of an engine failure, need not be the same as a return to a runway. I think you alluded to this at one point. The airport environment is normally clear of obstacles, and in the case of a towered airport, might even have crash rescue services. Thanks so much for that, Sam, and thanks for being a supporter. And here's an email from John Picard, writing from the UK. He says, Max, I've just listened to your latest episode concerning the turn back to the runway after an engine failure. I came to powered aviation in the UK via the gliding soaring route. Part of your pre-takeoff checks in a glider is to brief your eventualities, and you practice cable brakes for winches and rope brakes for aero towing. I think gliding experience brings a lot to powered aviation. He also writes, interestingly, this week we've been directed to think about rejecting a takeoff, and he included a link to a CAA article on rejected takeoffs, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. John, thanks so much for writing. And patron supporter Michael Baraz emailed and wrote, Hi, Max and Rob. I'm listening to episode 260 regarding the impossible turn. For better or worse, I have a long list of stuff that has happened to me that most pilots have never had actual experience with. The story below is of my third complete engine failure. He writes, back in October 2021, I had a new client, Bob, who I was giving transition training to in his new-to-him Mooney M20J. That is substantially the same airframe as my own M20K and my previous M20F, so I was in an airplane I was very comfortable with. As we were climbing out at the Aurora Airport, that's KARR, on runway 27, which is 7,000 feet long, as one does when taking off, even though I'm very familiar with the airport, having previously been based there, I was looking forward, left, and right for the place we'd put it down in the event of loss of power. That thought prompted me to ask, Bob, what is the minimum altitude you'd need to make the turn back to the runway? He made a couple of guesses that seemed reasonable. I said, let's not guess, let's find out. So we climbed above the Class D airspace up to 3,500 feet, which was 2,800 feet AGL, centered us up on the localizer back to the opposite direction runway, and had him pull the throttle and count to 5. I then had him pitch for best glide and start the turn back and intercept localizer inbound. When we were established, we took note of the altitude lost. It was a bit less than 750 feet. I said, you now know for sure. And I continued, if you had less, you could have made a right turn to runway 15 with no change in the direction of the turn and made an easy 240-degree turn back to the runway heading. We were both satisfied with having that in our back pockets. 5 weeks later, I'm picking up my own airplane after the installation of an electronic ignition system that replaced one of the mags. I needed to test fly the plane. I figured I'd take off and spiral up a couple thousand feet and stay above the airport in case I had issues. I did my pre-flight run-up and took off a runway 36 at Clow International, that's 1C5. Climbing out at about 600 feet or so, I was surprised when the TKS windshield spray bar seemed to turn itself on and was dousing the windshield. How curious that seemed. I reached over to turn it off. As I expected, it was off. This is while I was starting my crosswind turn at about 700 feet AGL. And with only another second to ponder that strange behavior, the engine went totally quiet. I was now at 900 AGL. With that exercise with Bob fresh in my mind, I knew that I was well above 750 feet. Before takeoff, I saw a plane holding short to take off after me. As I confidently turned back to the airport, I saw the plane still holding short doing a run-up or whatever delayed him from immediately following me out. I radioed back to clear the runway. I had an emergency and was returning to land opposite direction, runway 18. I bled off some speed and dead stick landed at about 90 knots. I rolled to a stop right at the end of the runway. And he writes that after they pulled the cowling off, they found that the nut on the fuel supply tube from the fuel pump was not tightened onto the threaded input fitting on the injector distributor. That explained the mystery of the TKS windshield spray bar, which was actually spraying 100 low lead up from under the cowl cover. Michael, thanks so much for sharing your experience and for being a Patreon supporter of the show. And here's a question that came in from Patreon supporter Juliet Sierra in Florida. And just to show you that we don't make stuff up on this podcast, I got an official answer from no less than the FAA headquarters. Here's his message. He wrote, "Hi, Max. Recently found your show and I love what you do. I'm a fairly new instrument-rated pilot working on my commercial. My question is about airport radar. I was wondering if you happen to know the deciding factor for when an airport would install one. I would think this would be mandated by the FAA at some point based on perhaps traffic volume. One of our local Class D airports, KOCF, has gotten extremely busy lately with an abundance of training traffic and 135 operations. 2 years ago, we had one flight school, and now we have 4. It feels like every flight I have had the past month, there has been someone in the pattern or approaching the field that has had a close call, and the poor tower controllers, you can tell, are working their tails off, trying their best to keep separation without the help of radar. With mid-airs making headlines lately, I fear that someone will be swapping paint here soon if something isn't done. Are controllers able to use ADS-B data in the tower at all to aid in situational awareness? Thanks again for helping us pilots stay educated in the show. Now over to your Patreon to sign up." Well, Juliet Sierra, thanks so much for supporting the show and for your question. So I contacted the Public Affairs Department of the FAA. They forwarded my request on to the FAA headquarters, and their Office of Communication sent this answer. Regarding the FAA's criteria for when to add a radar feed in the tower of a busy Class D, they wrote, "The FAA considers a number of factors when approving a radar feed at a Class D airport. Such factors may include operational need, traffic volume, funding requirements, and if there is a radar feed available in the Class D tower area." And by radar feed, I think essentially what that means is they're not going to be installing a new radar anywhere, but what they'll be checking to see is that data available from some existing radar at some distance away, and can they put in a display in the tower which would display that radar data, hence that radar feed. And the second question was, are tower controllers with radar feeds able to access ADS-B data? And they wrote back, all FAA air traffic automation systems are capable of receiving and displaying ADS-B data. So Juliet Sierra, thanks so much for your question, and thanks to the FAA for giving us a quick answer to that. And here's an email from Bill Barry in Massachusetts. Bill says, "Your podcast is always at the top of my playlist, but the last 2 episodes have been amazing. You're a spectacularly good interviewer, and my head is starting to swell here. Thank you, Bill. Episode 258 with Arturo Guerra was just heartrending, and I just wish I had something helpful to say to him other than, hang on, you are here for a reason. Episode 259 was another great interview, but with a completely different vibe. What a fun and entertaining talk with Ken Dravis. Thanks for all you do, Max, and keep up the good work." And if you didn't hear those episodes, they were both published over the Christmas holiday. Check them out, episode 258 and 259. And here's an email from Patreon supporter J.D. Goldstein. He writes, "I recently completed upgrade training and am now a captain on the B777F freighter. Prior to my airline career, I flew in the Air Force for 21 years. When I'm not flying freight all over the world, I fly my Cessna Cardinal out of my home airport in New Jersey. I've listened to every episode of Aviation News Talk, which I find amazing. That's 260 hours of material. And you've made me a better, safer, more knowledgeable pilot. Thanks for all you do for the aviation community." JD, thanks so much for that kind message. And I recently mentioned the Flying Companion Seminar given by the 99s organization, and I had a couple people write to me about that. One comes from Gideon Avita, and I'll be flying his Twin DA-42 tomorrow. He says that AOPA has the Companion Copilot series of videos. It's a series of 5 YouTube videos with a total of 28 minutes worth of material, and he said that that was quite helpful, so I'll go ahead and include a link to that in our show notes, so you may want to share that with your partner or spouse or friend who's not yet a pilot, and that way they can help you in the cockpit. And from Patreon supporter Alan Markham, he writes, "Regarding the 99's Flying Companion Seminar, Many years ago, my wife also took a similar course, AOPA's pinch hitter course. I joined her. I was surprised that there were only 2 licensed pilots in the room, the instructor and me. My wife and I both benefited from my attending with her, since we then both knew what the course had covered. I can certainly recommend that approach to other pilots. Accompany your special person at the Flying Companion, pinch hitter, or similar course. Show them that you appreciate their taking the course and come away with a better understanding of what's been covered. As always, thanks for the podcast. And thanks, Alan, for your message and for supporting the show. And speaking of show supporters, in a moment I'm going to read the people who have recently joined to help support the show in the last 2 weeks. But I did want to mention that this just barely offsets the number of people who've had to drop out, most of them because of changes in their financial situation. So we're staying just about even. So if you've thought about giving in the past to help support the show, now would be a great time to do that. Head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Takes just a couple of minutes and you can become a member of the club and help support the show. But special thanks to our 2 new mega supporters. This one comes from Norway. Lars Preben Sorsdal has signed up at the $50 level, so he'll be getting one of my books after a few months. I'll tell you more about him on a future show. And also special thanks to Renato Steinberg, who's increased his pledge from $35 a month to $50 a month. And I'll tell you more about both of these gentlemen in a future show. And now thanks to these new Patreon supporters who've signed up in the last 2 weeks. They include 3 people who've signed up at the $20 a month level, so they'll get access to my videos. Speaking of which, I've just posted a video in which I used my 360 video camera to shoot a bay tour flying over the San Francisco Bay, so you may want to check that out. I also added a number of comments about what I learned about shooting 360 video, both some of the trade-offs, the pros and cons of using the GoPro Max. And my thanks to Jason Stewart, MP Rogers, and Mitchell Berger, who've all signed up at the $20 a month level, and also to Joseph Morales, who's increased his pledge to the $20 a month level. Thanks also to Pamela Schneider and Isaac Pollock, who signed up at the $8 a month level, and to Heather McNevin, who signed up at the $35 a month level, so she'll be getting access to my online courses. And thanks you to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. Coming up next, we'll talk about the fatal accident that occurred near the Westchester County Airport, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Today we're going to talk about a crash that occurred last week near the Westchester County Airport in upstate New York. Unfortunately, the crash was fatal and killed both the pilot and the passenger. And of course, the reason we talk about accidents is so that we can learn from them. Although the preliminary NTSB report is not out, we do have the ATC audio, which gives us an excellent picture of how this accident unfolded. We'll first listen to the audio, and I'll periodically interject to tell you about the aircraft's altitude, airspeed, climb, and descent rates. We, of course, have the benefit of hindsight, knowing that what initially looked like perhaps a small engine problem apparently in time turned into a severe problem and quite likely was a complete engine failure based on the descent rate over the last few minutes. This was a heroic effort by both the pilot and the controller, but unfortunately it did not work out despite their best efforts. Frankly, the odds were stacked against them as the weather at the Westchester County Airport at the time was 300-foot overcast. In all emergencies, there are things that possibly could have been done better. And we talk about these things so that we can learn from them and hopefully make fewer of these mistakes ourselves if we ever find ourselves in a similar situation. The conversation you'll hear took place over a period of 21 minutes, and throughout most of this time, the controller was busy handling a number of airliners. I've cut out most of those airline calls in the early part of the conversation, though you'll hear them in the last portion of the audio, which is played in real time, so that you'll get a sense for the timing of the last few minutes. As you listen, look for things that perhaps could have been done better. After we listen to the audio, I'll talk about what I heard, and you can see how it compares with what you observed. November 19 Mike Tango, a Beech BE-36, a six-place single-engine aircraft, departed JFK Airport at about 4:58 p.m. local time, or just a little before dark. Visibility was 3 miles in smoke, with 3-knot winds from the north-northwest, and the sky was reported clear. The aircraft was returning home to its home base in Ohio and had a passenger and pilot on board. After the aircraft departed JFK, for the first 2 minutes, it climbed at rates between 550 and 950 feet per minute. But after those first 2 minutes, the climb rate dropped to about 375 feet per minute. The audio we'll listen to starts 10 minutes after departure as the aircraft is checking in with a New York approach controller at 3,700 feet, with a climb rate of about 250 feet per minute, or about half of the minimum 500 feet per minute climb rate required for IFR aircraft. The aircraft is about 18 miles northeast of JFK, headed due north, and the Westchester Airport is almost straight ahead 20 miles away. Here's that check-in that occurred at 5:08 p.m.
New York departure, November 19 Mike Tango, on a 360 heading.
19 Mike Tango, New York. Just confirm you're on a 360 heading, climbing to 8,000.
Leaving 3,700 for 8,000. Yeah, 360 heading.
87, proceed direct Newell.
Direct Newell, JetBlue 2187.
This next transmission was 2 minutes later as the aircraft was climbing through 4,000 feet at 200 feet per minute. With this slow climb rate, the pilot already knew that there was some kind of problem.
Number 19 Mike Tango, proceed direct to Sparta. Just maintain your best rate of climb all the way up to 8,000.
Okay, direct Sparta all the way up to 8,000. I'm doing my best here. Thank you.
2 minutes later, at 5:10 p.m., we hear this transmission, and interestingly, the pilot did not respond.
19 Mike Tango, traffic 2 o'clock and 4 miles southwestbound in E190 at 4,000.
About 6 minutes later, at around 5:16 p.m., the aircraft is westbound at 5,300 feet and passing just 6 miles south-southeast of the Westchester Airport when this exchange occurred.
New York departure, November 19 Mike Tango. Can we stop our climb at 6,000?
You can for now, but I have to climb you to 8 along this route. So if you want to level off at 6 for a minute to accelerate or do something, that's fine, but I am going to keep you climbing to 8 in about 10 to 15 miles.
All right. We're not getting the performance we're expecting, and I'm not certain why. 19 Mike Tango.
Roger, are you unable 8,000? I can get you an alternate route up over Huguenot, probably that'll keep you down low.
I also understand why we're only climbing at about 200 feet per minute, and the reason why we shouldn't be. So 8,000 is going to take a long time to get to 19 Mike Tango.
19 Mike Tango, Roger. And you think you might have an issue, or is it just you're not sure what's going on?
What's going on? I don't see anything on the instrumentation at all, except for lack of vertical speed.
All-Star 422, turn left heading 220, climb and maintain 12,000.
All-Star 442, 12,000, 220, All-Star 442.
Jazz 993, turn left heading 310.
Left turn 310, Jazz 993.
Recap 4667, contact departure 124.75.
2475, Brickyard 4667.
Number 19 Mike Tango, the Westchester County Airport's right off your right wing if you want to land and check it out.
The pilot didn't respond, perhaps because he was busy troubleshooting. And about a minute later at 5:18 p.m., with the aircraft at 5,900 feet and climbing at 300 feet per minute, the aircraft is 6 miles south-southwest of the Westchester Airport, and the pilot calls approach.
New York departure, we have figured out the problem. I've got a dead cylinder, so we would like to go to Westchester, and I'll take vectors for that. 19 Mike Tango.
19 Mike Tango, you're clear to the Westchester County Airport via radar vectors. Turn right heading 340 and maintain 5,000.
Right 340, maintain 5,000, 19 Mike Tango.
19 Mike Tango, they are landing runway 16, so you can start planning the ILS runway 16.
It's going to take me a minute to get things changed around here.
It's all good, take your time. Street 5070, turn left heading 220.
The vector of 340 would have set the aircraft up for a right downwind on the west side of the airport, which was the closest side of the airport to the pilot when he was issued that vector. The controller continued to work other aircraft. 45 seconds later, at about 5:20 p.m., we hear this exchange.
19 Mike Tango, are you declaring an emergency?
Not at this time.
Roger.
A half minute later, we hear this exchange.
Just to verify, that's Hotel Papa November. 19 Mike Tango.
19 Mike Tango, affirmative. Hotel Papa November, and they're using the ILS for runway 16.
About 30 seconds later, a full 2.5 minutes after the controller issued a vector of 340 to the airport, the aircraft has still not turned. It is now 7 miles southwest of the airport, and we hear this exchange.
19 Mike Tango, when you can, make a right turn heading 340. Looks like I see you doing it now.
I am declaring an emergency. Our oil pressure is dropping. 19 Mike Tango.
Skywest 5396, contact departure 11817.
Asian 70, good day, Skywest 5396, good luck.
New York District 5070, confirm assigned altitude, please, 15,000.
Who was asking about the altitude?
It's not clear if the controller heard that the pilot declared an emergency as he continues to work other aircraft. It's possible that he did hear it, and he now had his D-side controller and even possibly a supervisor helping him, and that he was doing the best he could to hand off aircraft to other sectors so he could focus on the emergency aircraft. But nearly a full minute after the pilot declared an emergency, the aircraft is now headed due east, essentially reversing course and not flying north toward the right downwind. Ultimately, the aircraft is so far out of position to the east that the controller brings it in on a left downwind on the east side of the airport. This clip will run in real time, including all airliner transmissions and all pauses. It's now 5:22 p.m., and the aircraft will be on the ground in just 7 minutes.
19 Mike Tango, it looks like you're on a hard right turn to the southeast. So I just want you to fly wings level and maintain 5,000. Can you do that?
Wings level 5,000. November 19 Mike Tango.
I don't care what heading, just fly wings level at 5,000. Southwest 1807, turn left heading 310.
Heading 310, Southwest 1807.
Blue Street 5070, contact departure 12085.
2085, District 5070, good night.
American 1599, just want to confirm 15,000.
Confirmed. 2,500 for 15,000, American 1599.
Number 19 Mike Tango, so what heading do you show yourself on now?
I am on a 090 heading, and we are going to declare emergency. We are losing oil pressure.
19 Mike Tango, roger. Can you turn left heading 070, vectors ILS 16?
070 for the ILS 16, 19 Mike Tango.
Southwest 1807, contact departure 11817.
1817, good day, Southwest 1807.
19 Mike Tango, understand you're losing oil pressure?
Yes, we are losing oil pressure. This is an emergency. 19 Mike Tango.
19 Mike Tango, roger. I'm vectoring you. You're right overhead the Westchester County Airport now, so I'm going to put you on a left downwind for runway 16.
Okay, vectoring me for a left downwind for runway 16, 19 Mike Tango.
1599, turn left heading 310.
310 heading, American 1599.
Number 19 Mike Tango, turn left heading 360.
Left turn, 360, 19 Mike Tango.
Departure 1581, American 1581, 2.4 on the 10 of 6.
Nine Mike Tango, heading 360 and maintain 3,000.
Down to 3,000, 19 Mike Tango.
Departure American 1581, 3,000 on the 10 of 6.
American 1581, radar contact, climb to maintain 15,000.
15,000, American 1581.
Number 19 Mike Tango, the bases at Westchester are reported at 300 feet.
I flew that ILS a couple weeks ago, so we'll try for it.
Okay, but do you want to fly the ILS, or do you want to, I'm not sure, do you have engine power right now? Are you able to maintain altitude?
No, the engine is overriding right now.
American 1581, turn left heading 310.
Turn 310, American 1581.
Southwest 1599, go direct parks, contact departure 12085.
That for American?
Mayday, 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 mayday.
Number 19 Mike Tango, understand the airport's just behind you now. You want to start at a left turn if you can. I'm seeing a right turn. American 1581, heading 290.
290, American 1581.
And center, was that for American 1599 to direct park in 2085?
American 1599, all correct. 12085, direct park.
All right, good luck.
Thank you. Number 19 Mike Tango, the airport is now at your 8 o'clock and 5 miles. 19 Mike Tango, heading would be 220 direct to the runway. 220 heading direct to the runway. American 1581, go direct Biggie, contact departure 12085.
Biggie 12085, American 1581, good luck.
19 Mike Tango, the airport's now at your 11 to 10 o'clock and 3 miles. The airport's now 12 o'clock and just under 3 miles now. Number 19 Mike Tango, you're set up perfectly for a left base to runway 16, 11 o'clock and just under 2 miles. Number 19 Mike Tango, you look beautiful for the left base for runway 16. Airport's at your 10 o'clock and 2.7 miles.
I've got 2,300 feet of altitude.
Understood, yes. One 19 Mike Tango, thank you. The airport's at your 9 to 10 o'clock and 2.4, so you're looking really good for that left base. Again, the bases are reported at 300.
Give me those vectors because I can't see a thing up here.
I understand. You want to turn back to the right now. That left turn you just did there, you want to turn back to the right, heading 2, maybe a 230, heading to set you up for the final. Winds are 110 at 7. 19 Mike Tango, you are clear to land, runway 16. Runway's at your 10 o'clock at 1.7 miles, turn left, heading 160. 19 Mike Tango, heading 160 for the runway. Number 19 Mike Tango, I'm showing the runway off your left wing, 1.7 miles. In 900 feet indicated, just make sure you'll break out at 300, you should see the lights. And 19 Mike Tango, the airport's now at your 10 to 11 o'clock and 1.6 miles.
10 to 11 o'clock.
19 Mike Tango, you just want to go slightly left and keep the shallow descent going. You should break out here shortly. 19 Mike Tango, you want to go more like a 150 to 140 heading to the runway. 19 Mike Tango, you want to correct back to the left now for the runway at your 10 o'clock. Radar contact lost. 19 Mike Tango, the runway's at your 10 o'clock in less than a mile. 19 Mike Tango, radar contact lost. Number 19 Mike Tango.
The frequency was then quiet for the next 2.5 minutes, and then a different controller was at the microphone. In the last transmission, you can hear the emotion in the controller's voice, and I can only imagine the anguish this man felt at the end, knowing that it was unlikely that the pilot made it to the airport. You may have found it hard as I did to listen to the audio, knowing that both pilot and controller were under tremendous stress, and yet, despite their best efforts, they were unable to succeed. Now let's talk about some of the things we heard. The biggest thing I heard was that the pilot was slow to declare an emergency. Had he done so earlier, things might have worked out better, though we'll never know that for sure. He apparently knew that something was wrong from the time he checked on. From FlightAware data, it appears that the aircraft climbed normally for the first 2 or maybe 3 minutes after takeoff, but for the rest of the flight, the aircraft was not climbing well. The first transmission we heard was 10 minutes into the flight, and even though the aircraft's climb rate had been poor for the past 6 or 7 minutes, the pilot didn't mention it to the controller. The pilot finally declared an emergency about 22 minutes into the flight, even though at that point he had apparently been having engine issues for nearly 20 minutes. In general, pilots are slow to declare an emergency, and we certainly saw that here. There are probably many reasons for this, and most of them are invalid. Many pilots are concerned that if they do declare an emergency, that they'll then have to spend lots of time filing reports, that their actions will be scrutinized, and that perhaps they'll be faulted in some way, either for declaring an emergency or for their actions that preceded the emergency. It's almost as if pilots wait until the situation is so bad that there can't be any doubt that there's an emergency. In other words, they wait until the engine actually quits or flames reach the cockpit before declaring an emergency. In my 50 years of flying, I did declare an emergency one time, and I was surprised to see that there was zero interest from ATC or the FAA in having me fill out any paperwork or discuss what happened. I simply landed at a towered airport, got switched to ground, and was told, "Good day." End of story. I think everyone was happy that I landed okay and moved on to whatever they had to do next. So I'm here to tell you that there is no downside to declaring an emergency. In fact, there's only upside. Typically, when you declare an emergency, all other aircraft on frequency get handed off immediately to other sectors, so your controller can devote 100% of his or her attention to you. Also, they're not doing it alone. They have lots of people in the background to help them. Most likely, if you're talking to a center or approach controller, they already have a second controller, the D-side controller, working with them, and that person now is also focused on helping you out. He or she will be researching weather at nearby airports, talking to controllers at those airports to have them clear their airspace, and they'll even get a landing clearance from the controller and pass it along to you so that you don't have to change frequencies. In addition to the D-side controller, a supervisor will have joined them. The controller will run their emergency checklist. Yes, they too have an emergency checklist, and they practice using it when they do their recurrent training every year. But all of this help and assistance doesn't become fully available to you until you declare an emergency. Or, in some cases, the controller will declare an emergency for you. In this case, you heard that until nearly the very end, this controller didn't have all of those benefits. He was having to work numerous other aircraft because an emergency hadn't been declared. Had an emergency been declared earlier, all of those aircraft would have been moved off frequency sooner, freeing the controllers to focus on just the emergency aircraft. So the number one issue I heard was that the pilot could have gotten more resources sooner if he declared an emergency earlier. Remember, you don't have to wait until the engine has quit or flames are in the cockpit to declare an emergency. You can declare an emergency whenever you start to think that you might have a problem and you want to get on the ground yesterday. Note that throughout the conversation, the pilot apparently knew he had a problem of some sort and was trying to troubleshoot the problem. He noted that his climb rate was poor. Anytime you have a poor climb rate, you should be thinking about these things. Is the aircraft configured properly? Are the gear and flaps up? If they're not, you won't climb as well. Next, are you in the clouds and possibly picking up ice? If not, then the most likely answer is that you have some type of problem with the engine. It doesn't really matter what kind of problem you're having. What matters is that you get the aircraft on the ground as soon as possible. Just last week in episode 260, I mentioned that when an engine is not developing full power, you can't assume it will continue to produce power at that reduced level. Almost certainly, the problem will eventually get worse and you'll have even less power and possibly a complete engine failure. We've also talked a few times on the show about how when you get a low oil pressure reading, you're often only 2 or 3 minutes away from a complete engine failure. Years ago, I used to think that when you got a low oil pressure reading, that it might be like getting the check engine light in your car and you could continue to fly for a long time before you'd get that light checked out. Well, not so in airplanes. By the time you get a low oil pressure reading, you are probably really close to having a complete engine failure. So get on the ground immediately. The next biggest thing I saw was the 2.5-minute delay from the time the controller issued a vector for Westchester County Airport until the aircraft started to turn to that assigned heading. During that time, the pilot was asking about the identifier for the airport and was possibly loading the ILS approach. Contrast that with the experience of Boeing test pilot John Tugas, who we talked with in episode 184, about his engine failure in a Bonanza. John flies with the nearest page of his GPS selected, and the moment he had engine problems, he immediately turned to the nearest airport. There was no need for him to ask ATC for a suggested airport or a vector or even the identifier for an airport. Instead, because of his training, he was primed and ready to turn to the nearest airport immediately at the first sign of engine trouble. There were a couple of minor opportunities that the controller might have taken advantage of. When he had the aircraft to beam the airfield on the left downwind, the aircraft was at 5,000 feet and the controller cleared the aircraft down to 3,000 feet. It appears the pilot complied with that instruction, as the highest descent rates of the entire flight, 1,300 to 1,800 feet per minute, occurred in the descent between about 4,100 and 3,100 feet. I don't know if the controller's emergency checklist talks about letting pilots remain high when they're having engine difficulty, but perhaps it should. If I'm having engine trouble, I want to stay high as long as possible. And if I'm high on final, then I'll use a slip to lose that excess altitude. On an ILS, a typical single-engine aircraft descends at around 500 feet per minute. However, with an engine failure, that aircraft may be descending at 1,000 feet per minute, even when trimmed for best glide speed. So an aircraft flying ILS with an engine failure needs to be twice as high above the ground at every point along the ILS. If the final approach fix is 2,000 feet above the ground, I'd want to pass over it at least 4,000 feet above the ground if I had an engine failure. An additional resource that controllers have are maps that they can bring up during an emergency that show additional features such as highways. In this case, the pilot passed over Interstate 684 as he passed through 1,300 feet. When it became apparent that the airplane might not make the runway, it might have been possible to give a vector to keep the pilot over the interstate. Also, many GPS navigators can display interstate highways, so the pilot likely could have found that highway himself if he knew how to display the highways on his aircraft's GPS or on an EFB app such as ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot. But it was rush hour on a Thursday night, so the interstate was likely clogged with traffic. And with ceilings of 300 feet overcast, it was going to be difficult to break out of clouds in time to spot the highway or the runway. Had the weather been better, the pilot might have simply circled overhead the airport until he was in a position to fly an abbreviated traffic pattern and land. Perhaps the tragedy in all of this is that had the pilot diverted to the Westchester County Airport at the very first signs that his engine was not producing full power, it's possible he would have still had enough time to fly the ILS and land safely before the engine problems got even worse. So if there's one thing we should take away from this accident, it's that at the first sign of engine trouble, you should declare an emergency and get on the ground as soon as possible. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down.